If you are in college or you know a college student who is deconstructing their Christian faith, this episode hopes to give you some insight into where you are and answer some of your toughest questions. I have invited my former colleague and friend Anna Kitko on to help explore this topic. Hello, doubters. If something significant has caused you to question the Christian faith that you grew up with, and you are struggling to hold on, you are in the right place. At this channel, I seek to address some of the most often cited questions people have as they re-examine their faith stance. Today, we will look at some of the reasons college students begin to doubt and do our best to provide a few answers to those doubts. Anna is a cults and new religion specialist and apologist with Ratio Christi. She is the director of their University of Tennessee chapter, where she trains students, faculty, and the general public in the scientific, philosophical, and historical reasons for being a Christian. Anna, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's a very great privilege to be here, Tim. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you as well. So Anna, I want you to kind of sketch a little bit of how you got into college ministry in the first place to kind of set the stage for us as our conversation will continue.
Ultimately, my background is primarily in cult psychology stuff because back in high school, I had friends that were trapped in a really coercive cult group, and it took years and years and years to kind of process through all the theology and work with their elders and very high stress. But I realized in college that there just weren't enough people around to help me. And so I decided to drop my pre-med program, which is what I was doing. I was going to be a brain surgeon.
Oh, that's all?
Just that program. I dropped brain surgery in physiology for brain surgery and theology, and I became an apologist. And so then Ratio Christi, the ministry I work for, recruited me based on my specialty later on. And I had already had a little bit of campus ministry experience because I was a Lutheran campus minister back when I was doing my undergraduate work and teaching apologetics back then too. So I fit right in.
Well, of course, you fit right in the world of apologetics, particularly with Ratio Christi, which, again, I've mentioned before, but that's where you and I met, and that's where, you and I know each other from and had a chance to work closely there. So I want to start off with this question that you can we'll build some legs onto it, but what do you find, again, just in your personal experience doing college ministry, that are some of the questions that lead Christians into deconstructing or into eventually leaving the Christian faith?
Yeah, so most of my students are actually deconstructing right now or came to Ratio Christi specifically for that reason. And they're mainly concerned with the state of the church as an institution. They want to know about why Christianity responds the way that it does. And I say Christianity in air quotes because sometimes they don't even realize that they're not talking about Christianity formal, or they haven't been exposed to the theology, the things that are distinctives of orthodoxy, for example, who Jesus is, what exactly is the gospel, things along those lines. And so they don't understand how the church where they grew up or the surroundings that they had that were kind of Christian-esque in a cultural way respond to the social issues that are important to them. Things like last night we dealt with at a meeting the Israeli-Palestinian debate, for example. We had to go into the difference between dispensational theology and covenant theology and how you deal with the nation of Israel, because they were totally confused as to why their churches were getting into politics they didn't agree on. So I think it's just a lot of questions about how we got here, what it is exactly that we believe, and what's the difference between growing up in a Christian bubble and being a Christian firmly and fundamentally with a relationship with Jesus personally.
Okay, so we'll probably put some more legs on that here in a little bit, but contrast that maybe with what are the questions that some of your Christian students are asking? So those are maybe the ones that are questioning or deconstructing their faith. But what are the ones that you had mentioned to me before that some of your students in the past had thought that Ratio Christi was going to be essentially their seminary light, and so they were just looking really to continue and further their education through the Ratio Christi chapter. So what are some of the questions that those students had that may be different from the questions that either the non-Christian students in your chapter or those that are deconstructing are having?
So the Christians that were wanting seminary light, they're really interested in how the Bible got put together, so the canonization process, and then hermeneutics. So we did an entire semester on how exactly to interpret the scriptures. What is the hermeneutical circle? How do you go about removing yourself and your biases from the text so that you can actually get the author's original intent? How do you discover what the ancient audience would have thought? How do you extract the timeless principles from that material? And then finally, how do you apply it to homiletics or preaching and make it applicable to a contemporary audience? And so a lot of that stuff, a lot of that processing, they just had never gotten before. And they're like, just show me, walk me through how to do this, which is primarily what we were working on.
Yeah, so again, they're looking to, apply it to their life. They're looking to explain it to other people, and so they're just really trying to figure that out, which is again wholly different than maybe some of these other questions like, man, how are we doing this? What's the church doing politically? What's the church doing, in these kind of moral, social issues? So that's really interesting. I noticed some of the things that you didn't necessarily touch on were things like identity. How much do you find the role of identity, sexual identity, transgenderism, and those things, are those playing much of a role in the students that you're interacting with, or you find that that's not as much?
It depends on their background. So the ones that are wanting the hermeneutics, they couldn't care less about the identity politics. They just don't even want to deal with it. They see it as a giant dumpster fire and they just don't even want to engage. But with the deconstructing students, it's a huge deal.
Hmm.
So when we receive questions, and in our chapter, it's entirely student oriented as far as what we study. The biggest questions that came in is please explain homosexuality and please explain transgenderism. And I normally separate those two for philosophical reasons, but yeah, it's a giant issue as far as sexual ethics is concerned.
Now, again, we don't have to go too much into detail, but are you finding that students are asking the question about like women in ministry or women being oppressed throughout the history of the church and how that relates to you as a woman being a Christian? Did you find those play a role at all?
Not lately. They did a few years ago. One of our largest meetings had about 50 students in it, and we did the women in ministry debate between egalitarianism and complementary. Very, very big deal. But we were in a setting that was staunchly not, I mean, very obviously classical complementarianism, all the way to the point that women couldn't even lead prayer.
Hmm.
So that was really important for the college students to really engage that background. Now, not so much. It's just kind of seen as something that doesn't need to be discussed. And of course, there are women leaders, and of course, that's something that should be that way.
Right. Well, no, that's good. So okay. So let's kind of dive into maybe how you answer some of the questions. I know that you were talking a little bit about, um, at your chapter last night, and you can go back as far as you'd like here. About the Palestinian and Israel conflict. So maybe just on that point alone, because I know that's really interesting right now, and it's kind of one of the things that's been in the news, and it's one of the reasons that your students again are asking the question. So maybe lay out, kind of set the groundwork for maybe why that's a question for people, and then kind of where you fall on that and how you would answer that.
So this is complicated in that our students ultimately wanted to study eschatology. That was the ultimate question, and it stemmed from a little video clip that's from here in Tennessee, where we are, saying that the vaccines for COVID were the mark of the beast,
Hmm.
which is a fairly regular talking point. So they've never studied eschatology, so we said, well, let's go ahead and go into it. And primarily what we discovered was that everybody in the room was a pre-tribulation rapture, premillennial assumptions about that's the only way that we can orient ourselves in the book of Revelation. And I was like, well, they don't even realize that there are alternative positions. And so we jumped into that. And then it kind of devolved into, well, how did my church get this way? And what do you mean Israel and the church could be the same? Aren't they automatically something that, isn't it America and Israel together and they're going to bring about the eschaton? And so that's where these discussions went. But then interestingly enough, the other half of the room came from a completely different background that saw the Palestinian Christians as oppressed and abused, and how could we possibly be sending tithe money to Israel, things along those lines. And
Hmm.
it was just a shock. Ultimately, they all assumed that their position was the only one that was out there. And so the way that I handled these questions, especially something that's that charged, and in any way political. We try to keep it as anti-political as possible in our group, but you can't get away from it sometimes.
Right.
What I do is I simply turn it back on them and I say, why did you have this assumption? And normally it exposes a level of ignorance of the scriptures so that we can get right back to the Bible, which is the whole point. Bible literacy. I really believe that that's the number one problem among college students is they just don't know the Bible at all. They have tons of assumptions. They think they've engaged it before, but they really haven't. And when you put it back to them and say, well, when was the last time you actually personally opened this book and studied it? They can't tell me. And so
Wow.
that's what we focus.
That's significant. So again, this opens up so many different areas that we could go. So do you think just on that one topic, that you had such disconnecting views, right, of what the church said and what their understanding is? Now, did you attempt to, broaden that umbrella and say, okay, well, maybe there's a little bit of truth in both of these, or were you trying to kind of say, let's hone in on one or the other perspective?
Really, I just try to educate because I'm not entirely sure. It's the beginning of the year, so I don't know the students well enough to know what they need. And as you know well with apologetics and even with deconstructing individuals, the questions that they raise usually have an underlying question beneath them, right? And so the goal is to answer both questions so that they feel heard, but also so that the meat is there and you really grapple with the real issue that they're dealing with. And so with this, it was more educating broadly. So they didn't even know the difference between dispensational theology and covenant theology. And so we just started with that basis. We talked about John Nelson Darby. I showed them a Schofield Reference Bible. I talked about how it got from Ireland to the US and that it's a new thing. Darby didn't even begin this idea of pre-tribulation rapture until well after 1830. So this is brand new material that we're just using as though it's been here for the history of the church. And they're like, this is amazing. I had no idea. I've never heard any of this. And that, of course, that just broadens the horizon for possibilities for other things to discuss. And that way I get to know them a little bit better.
So again, for the audience, let's lay out those two different, kind of broad schools of thought, because some people might be saying, well, wait a second, I came from this one, and, you're kind of rocking my world as well. So as far as when you say dispensationalism, what all is entailed in that, particularly when it comes to eschatology?
So classical dispensationalism is essentially how to orient oneself when you bring yourself to the Bible overall. How does
Okay.
God interact with mankind? And so dispensationalism organizes the scriptures in a certain way, and then covenant theology organizes them in a little bit different way. They're both biblical standpoints. You can feel safe learning either one, but I think it's really important that we do learn both because there is a disagreement. And the fundamental disagreement comes down to, is the church the spiritual Israel, meaning is the nation of Israel, does it matter as a geopolitical nation like it did in the Old Testament now? And dispensational theology would say, yes, there is a hard line between the nation of Israel and the promises that were made to the nation of Israel by God, and then the church as a whole. So we have two separate things that we need to deal with, versus covenant theology that marries the two and says, no, it was always intended that the church be Israel, that Israel becomes the church. And then when Acts chapter 2 at Pentecost occurs, the nation of Israel itself as a physical geographical nation no longer matters because it's taken over by the church. It is always supposed to have been that way. So in modern era stuff with politics, the dispensational side would look at the nation of Israel becoming a nation again in 1948 as fulfilled prophecy. They would see the Trump administration putting an embassy in Jerusalem as a confirmation that prophecy is indeed being fulfilled, versus the covenant theology folks that would go, it really doesn't matter. I mean, we're happy for Israel, but the idea that we need to look at that as some sort of prophetic or accelerated way of bringing about the eschaton is just not true. So that's where that divide comes in.
Well, and I think that's really interesting because it's been kind of growing more and more, particularly over the last maybe 5 or 6 years, where Christians have, right or wrong, or whether this charge is right or wrong, have been accused of being kind of more political, if you will. I mean, we was always, in a sense, because Christianity is a worldview, but we've kind of gotten more fervent and more passionate about it. And then you could say that kind of came to a head with the election of Trump and kind of, his appealing to Christians or the evangelical or white evangelicals even. So there really is kind of some underpinning understanding of how you're reading the scripture or how you're going about interpreting some of the things in scripture that may have undergirded or played into that kind of fervor and passion, if you will, for someone like Trump being in office. So again, because I've worked at Ratio Christi and led chapters similar to you, but just for the audience sake who hasn't had that experience, when you say we're trying to keep these things apolitical, how do you kind of walk that line, right, between some of these things that are highly politically charged and do have political implications and, kind of trying to remain at that higher level of this is what's going on, this is what we're trying to remain apolitical here?
Right. So I just do brutal honesty, and I say, look, I don't ever want this group to look like or give you the impression that it's some closet underground way to bring in republicanism or conservatism or something along, which would be an assumption in my area.
Right.
that they just go hand in hand, and that's because Christian nationalism is very big in my state. And so I say that Ratio Christi, the focus of Ratio Christi is evangelism. And that means even though these conversations are valuable and should be made, we can't get bogged down by them, and we can't allow ourselves to run away mentally with them to the point of being disobedient to our ultimate calling, which is to give the gospel. So if at the end of the day, you're not using these conversations to build a case for how to train yourself more effectively as an evangelist on campus for the sake of the gospel, then it isn't an edifying conversation. And we should pick something else because there's a myriad of other things we need to deal with. I mean, probably our biggest meeting, I think I've told you this before, our biggest meeting in the last year we had to have twice because we didn't fit enough people. And it was on cannibalism.
Wow.
Huge question on our campus. Because if you want to remove your carbon footprint from the world, then why can't you donate your body to be consumed if you can donate it to science, right? There's no murder, it's just recycling.
Yeah.
And it really challenged our students, and they didn't know how to answer that question, and we worked through it. And it's really fun for me because these are like non-Googleable questions. Right. Like you can't like go to Got Questions and get this answered easily.
Yeah.
So anything that we can do to provide that space to really chew on the subject matter, it's my bread and butter. I love it.
Well, that's fantastic. So, I mean, there is this kind of this push, this movement, and it's been growing for the last several years. And one of the reasons why Ratio Christi has continued to expand on the campuses of people asking these deep questions, of having kind of these, again, for lack of a better term, kind of these triggering questions that are just really causing them to doubt their faith. And you've talked about several of them, but look back for me over the few years that you've been with Ratio Christi, and maybe give me some of the main top 2 or 3 questions that you feel like you get often. So we talked about the ones that you had literally last night, and some of the identity questions that are kind of more and more coming more and more to the front. But are there questions that you've kind of seen like, man, every semester a new group of students comes and these are the things that they're asking on a regular basis?
100%. There's a clear winner, and is the Bible reliable?
Okay.
Happens every single semester, no matter what. And I always feel bad for the seniors because I don't gloss over it. We hit it every time. And I think the seniors could probably give the presentation verbatim. It's the thing that's repeated the most. They are desperate for it. We'll bring in an Old Testament scroll. And it's just, they're enthralled, and I'm shocked usually because again, it's content that you would think for a college student this might be like a snooze fest. I mean, we're talking about textual variants and we're talking about scribal errors and what they mean. But to them, this is the end all because it's the first time somebody has laid out why the Bible itself is a miracle, why it's so important, and it's not just some archaic artifact from a bygone age that is there to make you feel good if you want it and not if you don't, so they're enthralled, and I'm very pleased, but it's also extremely sad because the idea that we're not doing this in our churches as a foundational point is, I think, a huge mistake.
Well, I want you to maybe give your 10-minute presentation version of that here in just a second. But before you get to that, so I'll give you a few minutes to kind of collect your thoughts. I mean, again, I know that you can do it because, I mean, we're friends and I've seen you do it before. But do you think that is also some of the same questions that people that are outside of college, because I know that you've done, several presentations at churches. You're very involved in the kind of the larger church community there in Tennessee that you're at. So are adults, post college, asking that same question about the gospel being reliable, or do they have a different set of questions that they're asking?
No, it's exactly the same content, and it goes naturally from, well, is the Bible reliable? And we established, yes, it is. And then it's, well, what about, is this all that we need? Like, are there missing books? And so we go straight into canon. And once we've established that, it's the base. Sometimes the conversation is over. Sometimes even the folks that are deconstructing as adults, they're like, that's all I needed. Because all of a sudden you've demonstrated that, yes, actually it is trustworthy. We're not just relying on an ancient book that it was written by a bunch of dead white guys. Like, number one, they weren't white. So we can just disregard that one right off the bat, and now we don't have to deal with identity politics while we're talking about the Bible itself.
Right. Yeah, I'm always struck by the assumption, and again, it's maybe not a wrong assumption given the culture that we've have immersed ourselves in and that's surrounding us, but the assumption that the authors of Scripture were white. And it's like, you can look on a map fairly easily and look at anybody that's come from there. It's fairly similar. I mean, again, Paul was a Roman. He was not, European white, right? So, but anyway, so okay, so give us your 10-minute version of this presentation, Anna. Why should anybody trust the Bible? Why is the Bible authentic? Why is it not fake? I mean, Jesus didn't write this book himself. We have no, autographed letters from Jesus. We don't even know the people that wrote these books. We don't have any early manuscripts. I mean, why on earth would anybody trust this thing that we have in our phones right now as the Word of God?
Yeah. This is the most unique book that mankind has ever seen. It was compiled over 4,000 years, 66 different books, all of which across the entire score of the planet, basically on almost every continent. And yet it has synthetic unity, which means that everything agrees across the board, and there's no way to pull that off without there being some element to it, whether you agree with the supernatural or not. This is a very unique set of circumstances, unlike anything the world has ever seen. On top of that, we have more textual evidence for its veracity than any other book in the history of mankind. It is, if you were to apply textual standards to the Bible the way that you do for the rest of Greco-Roman literature, for example, the Bible sticks out so much like a sore thumb that it's alarming. And we have textual scholars, even that are non-Christians, who agree with this. So Bart Ehrman, who's done a lot of work to try to discredit the scriptures, admits this openly and has over radio programs and in his own books. So the idea that it isn't unique is something that is very foreign to even academics. So once we take that into account, regardless of the content, we have something that is so unique, it absolutely demands our attention. Historically, scientifically, philosophically, we cannot ignore it further. And interestingly enough, it contains the account of Jesus Christ, who has plenty of historical evidence to back up that he lived, that he walked, and that he did really, really amazing things, so much so that thousands of human beings were willing to die over their testimony as contemporaries to him. So we have all of this outside evidence, and this is before we even crack it open.
Right.
So yeah, the idea that we could ignore it, or that it's intelligent to just disregard it as something archaic, is so irrational. It's almost something we should scoff at the idea.
Right.
And that's where we start. Then we actually.
Say that last part again. Then we what?
I said then that, and that's just before we open it. Then we have to actually open the book.
And so what do we find when we open the book? Because aren't the Gospels, kind of just anonymous books? We don't know who actually wrote them. They may be attributed to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we don't know. There's no reference to the authors, in the book. What if these were just compiled later on and given authority, be like, oh, well, Luke wrote this and he was kind of a pretty well-known guy within this community, so we'll attribute these words to him. How come, whether they're anonymous or not, does that raise an issue for you with their authenticity or with their authority?
Not really, because the way when we do historical criticism, one of the things you look at is how widely these things were circulated and how quickly people affirmed that they were authentic. And the Quatrain Gospel, meaning all four Gospels, not including the lost Gospels like the Gospel of Thomas and things that came out centuries later that we knew came out centuries later and could not have been written by Thomas. The Gospels are not like that, and they actually date to the contemporaries of Jesus Christ himself. So even if we were to say, well, it wasn't really Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, which we do have evidence that they did actually exist and they were the authors, but let's just disregard that. Even if it's completely anonymous, it's accepted widely to the point of people willing to die over it. We don't see people taking issue with, well, actually, I know Matthew and he didn't write that at all.
Right.
Very early on. So either way, we can't disregard it as some sort of myth that was put together much later because we have evidence that that isn't the case.
Right. No, and I think that that's exactly right. I mean, even going down to something as narrow as like the resurrection, which again is central to the Christian claim. Whenever we're given the minimal facts argument from someone like Gary Habermas, the response that I see from the critic is always denying or at least having some significant doubts to one or more of the pieces of evidence. And even if you narrow it down, I think the smallest that I've seen Habermas do it is something like three main pieces of evidence, but he has up to 12 that he often does. You're still denying something that seems pretty well established in historical studies.
You have to ignore evidence in order to arrive at that conclusion rationally. And I mean that in a classic rational way. Like, be a skeptic. There's nothing wrong with that. It's wonderful. But don't be a cynic.
Right.
Cynicism often tries to parade as skepticism. Skepticism is a genuine desire to see what evidence there is there. A cynic says, I don't really care either way. I've already decided. So being honest about that distinction for how we feel first, and then dealing with the evidence that is there, because there is evidence and you have to deal with it. The Nazareth inscription, for example. We bring that up in our courses a lot when we talk about the resurrection. We have an inscription that dates to the time of Jesus that states quite clearly that you're not allowed to steal bodies out of tombs, and you'll be legally prosecuted if you're caught doing that. And there's the evidence for why that would be around would be because of the resurrection.
Right.
Like it's self-evident that that's why that inscription is there. You have to do a ton of acrobatics rationally to get out of that evidence. And it's okay if you want to do that, I suppose, but why would you want to do that?
Right.
Anyway.
Well, Anna, you did a great job. Again, we're scratched the surface as far as the evidence for and the case for the reliability of Scripture. Maybe we'll have you back on again to go deeper in that. But I have one more question before we wrap this up. And again, thank you so much for being on the program and sharing your wisdom with us. The last question that I have is, as far as the kind of maybe two broad categories, and there's several, but the two broad categories of maybe intellectual doubts and emotional doubts, which one do you tend to see more of kind of in your line of work? Are people coming with more like, man, this is the, kind of hurt or pain, or the evil that's going on in the world that's causing me to doubt? Or are they more intellectual where, it's more about like, man, I'm just really looking for an answer to this thing specifically? How would you rate your experience with students when it comes to that?
Emotional, primarily. But it usually presents itself as an intellectual question first. And very rapidly you realize that they really didn't do any research whatsoever into this question. It's very easily answered. And it's almost so superficial that you want to just sit them down and be like, who hurt you? And that's the question that we need to have. And I think it's an authentic question. It's something that we need to deal with as a church body in a lot of ways. And we shouldn't flee from those issues at all, because that's the entire purpose of being a Christian, is to be reconciled to our Messiah and to be reconciled to each other. And so if you're a deconstructing Christian, you're a brother or sister in Christ. And we should desire for that reconciliation, which means we should be honest, and we can deal honestly with abuse that has occurred. And we should. It's a good thing.
No, that's fantastic. Well, Anna, I loved that last answer and all of the answers that you've given, but I particularly love the last answer because it's so authentic, it's so real, and it's so true. So thank you so much for joining us. Any final thoughts or comments before I hit my closing?
It's a very great privilege. If there's anybody out there that's watching that wants more information on the stuff that we've talked about, we also have a YouTube channel where we film all of our public events so that you can see the live Q&A and everything. And it's just the Anna Kitko YouTube channel. Just check it out if it'll help you.
All right. Well, I'll put that in the description of this program, and I would encourage everybody to check out that as well and to check out Anna's work. So thank you so much for joining us on this episode where we talked to my good friend Anna, and hopefully she gave you some things to think about. Hopefully she helped you, look at your deconstructing process, or as I said at the very beginning, if you know someone that's deconstructing, it would be good to have an understanding of these different pieces that Anna talked about because she's in the trenches. She is having these conversations on a regular basis. I would challenge you to check out and subscribe to her YouTube channel. And if you are also in this position where you're deconstructing, we invite you to join our Facebook group. The link for that is also in the description, and to like this video and subscribe to this channel as we continue to hit some of these big questions that you have as you're going through this deconstructing process. I'll meet you next time as we deal with deconstruction.